Indonesia in Varieties of Peace Asia Conference 2019, held by the Center of Strategic and International Studies CSIS Indonesia, together with Varieties of Peace. Without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Philips Vermonte as the Executive Director of CSIS to give his welcoming remarks. Dr. Vermonte, the floor is yours.
His Excellency, Dr. Hassan Wirayuda, Indonesia's Foreign Minister, 2001-2009. Her Excellency Marina Berg, the Ambassador of Sweden to Indonesia. Professor Anna Jarstad, Directors of Varieties of Peace, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Very good afternoon to everyone. A warm welcome to Jakarta and to CSIS. It is my pleasure on behalf of CSIS to extend our welcome to the guests and participants of the Varieties of Peace Asia Conference 2019. Sorry. CSIS has the honor and privilege to co-organize this great event in collaboration with Varieties of Peace Research Program at Umeå University in Sweden, with the support of the Swedish Foundation for Humanities and Social Sciences. At CSIS, for years, we have taken great concern with matters of conflicts and atrocity prevention, as well as peace-building efforts. The first reason being that Indonesia has enjoyed almost 1.5 decades of peace in Aceh after the 2005 peace agreement between the Free Aceh Movement, or GAM, with Jakarta, that I believe will be further elaborated by His Excellency Pak Hassan Wirayuda as the living proof on how challenging is peace negotiation after 30 years of civil conflicts in our province. Such achievement is perhaps only possible due to the country's 1998 democratic turn experienced by Indonesia. Although with the rising of identity politics and conservatism, many questions the sustainability of democracy in Indonesia. If you happen to follow the news in the past 1 or 2 days, maybe you question even further with this negotiating cabinet formation. Another reason, of course, is our part of the world, our region, Asia, Southeast Asia, in which we are living, has not been a stranger to conflicts. As think tank, we always look for any concerted efforts working on this matter and try to participate in our capacity as best as we can. For instance, last year, CSIS hosted the Indonesian National Dialogue on the UN Framework of Analysis for Risk Atrocities. However, looking beyond risk atrocities or periods of conflicts and working deeper than on an international norm or framework of analysis, I believe this conference will remind us that there is also the need to pay attention further towards peace processes. And of course, I refer to peace processes not simply of the period in which conflict transition into peace, but also further into the various dynamics elements as to what constitutes certain condition of peace. In the roundtable during lunch, I was told that Sweden has enjoyed 200 years or more free from major conflicts, and I think that is something that we also want to achieve in this part of the world. So thank you for collaborating with us. Sweden is exactly the right partners that we need to learn from. Conflicts may end at armistice and settlement, but peace a long and arduous process. As a consequence of thinking in such a way, we may require a more local and nuanced point of view to really understand what makes stability and peace of a country or of a community. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that some of the conflicts which has come to surface in our region of Southeast Asia precisely demand us to put extra thought into processes beyond conflicts and into peace processes. This could mean to delve into studies of societies, or even perhaps of communities, and what makes them stick together in absence of conflicts for the sake of lasting peace. It is hard to imagine that there is such a thing as a one-size-fits-all for all when it comes to package of peace-building program or peace processes. Often as the sessions that follow will show us, thinking of peace processes may require us to pay attention into local relations between actors, for example, between local elites, landlords, etc., which may have been so rigidly established that it will be hard to adapt to conditions and systems totally new imposed to them by the international communities as solutions. Other times, local values and ideologies accumulate and produce its own path and sense towards what constitutes as peace. Some regions may be dominated by formulas of consisting of ethnical relations and religious actors. Other regions may only allow us to entirely put forward the idea of peace processes on the basis of reconciliations, but not respecting and fulfillment of human rights, which leave us to settle with impunities. Sounds very familiar for all of us in Indonesia. Some efforts may only invite civil societies and restrict the role of the states. Some others solely dependent on states and authorities. All the while, peace processes may also be subject to external geopolitical influence and pressures from bigger and stronger actors outside the region. These are some of the elements that will make up the varieties of peace and will be explored throughout our conference in the next 2 days. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, for the conference, we will have the opportunity to join discussion with a great list of panel speakers talking about their papers, which range from conceptual level of analysis, often talking about the need for rethinking of frameworks and thoughts of how we view peace processes, to the more practical level of analysis into the various alternative means of achieving lasting peace and maintaining it. We will be challenged to strike the balance between paying attention to the local varieties of peace, while also not overly glamorizing these localities to still think and produce a working solution. I hope the conference that will follow will trigger fruitful discussions and provide us with some ways of new, innovative approaches that we can learn from to collaborate with each other into really putting thoughts over the possible elements that could make lasting peace in the vulnerable regions in the world. Again, I'd like to convey CSIS gratitude to Varieties of Peace program and to all the speakers and discussants for your participation. Thank you for joining us, and please enjoy the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fermonte, for your insightful remarks. Next, we will have Professor Anna Jostart as the Director of Varieties of Peace to address her welcoming remarks. The floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you very much to Philip Vermont. And dear distinguished participants of the Varieties of Peace Asia Conference, I'm very happy to be here in Jakarta. It's my first time here, so I'm very excited. And I'm happy to welcome you all to this conference. We would not be here today unless of the very hard work of several people. So Please stand up when I mention your name. The first one that I would like to thank is, of course, Fitri from Csis. And we also have a couple of people from Sweden who has been involved in organizing this. It's Veronica, Elizabeth, and Alejandro. Thank you so much. I know that you have devoted a lot of time and energy into making this what looks like it's going to be a fantastic conference. So this conference is organized within the research program Varieties of Peace. And we are a group of scholars who are mainly based at Umeå University in Sweden, doing research on peace in different parts of the world. And the research, as well as this conference, is funded, as was already mentioned, by our sponsor, the Riksbankens Jubileumsfond, the Swedish Foundation for Humanities and Social Sciences. So, what does peace mean? Well, surprisingly, there's very little research on what peace is and what it means. Most peace and conflict research actually deals with conflicts. So there's been a focus on wars, armed conflict, and political turmoil. However, as we can see in this map by Uppsala Conflict Data Program, in most parts of the world there are no armed conflicts. The red dots here mark areas where there's conflict, but most of the world is actually peaceful. And here's also a map that more zooms in on Asia. And but the thing is, in this map, we only all the areas of peace, they look the same. There's no variation. But we know that the peace in North Korea, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, and Indonesia is, of course, not the same. The peace looks very different in different locations. There is one, the Global Peace Index. This map is from their website. They show different degrees of peace. And you can see that there's like more peace in France than in India. However, we think that it's problematic to make an index of peace. Instead of studying more or less peace, we think that it's more fruitful to study different types of peace. So we are interested in different variations and varieties of peace. And as I said, peace in Sri Lanka is very different from peace in Indonesia or in peace in Cambodia. And there are, of course, also within-country variations. The peace in the northern part of Sri Lanka looks different than in the southern part of the country. So, in our research program, we focus on peace processes that were initiated during the 1990s in order to analyze long-term variations and the consequences of such processes. Our research questions are, the first one is, what characterizes peace after peace processes initiated during the 1990s? And what type of variation do they portray? And the second question is, how can this variation be described and explained? Conventionally, there's been a division of, into positive and negative peace, where negative peace refers to the mere absence of violence, whereas positive peace refers to the absence of structural or indirect violence and the presence of social justice and reconciliation. It is also common to divide peace processes into successful peace processes and failed peace processes. But in reality, empirical cases that we study is somewhere in between or beyond these dichotomies. So therefore we have developed within our research group our own novel take on how peace should be researched, which builds on three approaches to peace: the situational peace, relational peace, and ideational peace. Oops, it's a bit too quick there. And this three-pronged approach is grounded in our review of current research, which shows that peace is a complex phenomenon. And we suggest that peace can be studied in these three different ways. First, peace as a situation or a condition in a particular location. Secondly, as a web of relationships on different analytical levels. And thirdly, as ideas or discourses about what peace is or should be. And we argue that it makes analytical sense to make this distinction, and that the three approaches together, they can be researched separately, but together they also provide a more fuller picture of what peace is, how it's manifested, experienced, understood, and therefore also how it should be analyzed. And this framework provides a way forward in advancing conceptual understandings and empirical analysis of peace, both in comparative work, while at the same time also accounting for the complex, multifaceted nature of peace. So through these three approaches, we aim to capture varieties of peace between and beyond these dichotomies that I mentioned. And we don't strive to articulate a single intermediate definition of peace, but rather develop different approaches that can identify, characterize, and theorize multiple diverse forms of peace that can be empirically observed in post-war societies. So we depart from a complex, or a conception of peace as a complex, dynamic process of becoming rather than an end state. Thus, a comparative analytical framework needs to be able to capture these multifaceted aspects of peace as well as dynamics of change. So as I said, peace is far more complex than just being the opposite of war. It has many different meanings in different contexts. And the main purpose of our program is to explore how the different varieties of peace that have resulted in peace processes initiated in the 1990s can be characterized, and to describe and explain this variation. And we thereby aim to make peace researchable and to stimulate research in this underdeveloped field of research. So our aim is to develop fruitful conceptual and theoretical frameworks for characterizing and explaining varieties of peace, and also to outline methodologies of how peace can be studied, and also generate new knowledge on empirical cases of different types of peace through in-depth case studies and comparative work. So I'm very happy to welcome you to this conference where we have invited scholars to present their ongoing work on peace. And I think what will become very evident during this conference is that peace can mean very many different things. So I just would like to encourage you all to talk to each other during the sessions, of course, but also in coffee breaks, and ask each other, what do you mean by peace? Maybe some think of it as the freedom to express your views. Others maybe emphasize social justice or social cohesion or something completely different. But I really look forward to interesting discussions during these coming days. And I'm happy to welcome you here, and now hand over to the Ambassador of Sweden, Marina Berg. Thank you.
We welcome Honorable Marina Berg, Her Excellency, the Ambassador of Sweden to Indonesia. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a true honor to stand in front of you addressing some key remarks, maybe key remarks, because the remarks I'm going to do is more political than actually the remarks that you are making. I live in a more simpler world, I must say, than the researchers do. But thank you very much also Center for Strategic and International Studies for hosting this event. And thank you very much together with Varieties of Peace that I get the opportunity to stand here and open up the conference. It's a great opportunity, of course, for us that this event takes place in Jakarta, considering the discussions that are going to take place about Aceh, West Kalimantan and East Timor. It's of great interest of ours, and also given the Indonesia's predominant role when it comes to peace building. I truly appreciate the important work that you do together. Your current approach, studying the variety of peace in Asia, will contribute to the foundation, of course, of our future diplomacy work. Ladies and gentlemen, the question we should ask ourselves is, can we afford an ever-growing list of crises slipping into violent conflict and needless human misery? The global community is spending around $25 billion a year on life-saving assistance or humanitarian assistance to 120 million people devastated by wars and natural disasters. While this amount is 12 times greater than 15 years ago, never before has generosity been so insufficient. The current humanitarian funding gap is estimated at this point of time to be $15 billion. So, ladies and gentlemen, this cannot continue. Although many humanitarian appeals remain unanswered, the issue of increasing humanitarian needs is not a humanitarian problem, it is political. To change policy, we need research. And perhaps most of what I'm going to talk about and say are based on your research or colleagues of yours. Studying the variety of peace, what makes peace sustainable and inclusive, saves money and prevent peaceful societies to relapse into conflict again, and that is prevention. And prevention requires addressing the root causes of conflict and instability, and to understand peace, I guess, is more or less about the same thing. It requires not only addressing the root causes, but also it requires understanding what makes peace sustainable and inclusive. We desperately need to think innovatively and boldly how to address the root causes, fueling conflicts, and find means to support sustainable, inclusive peace. There are some key components for lasting peace. Let me mention 3 of them on which the Swedish peace and security policy is built. Firstly, humanitarian aid can never be a permanent solution. It must be followed by long-term strategic thinking, funding, and efforts to strengthen institutional resilience against both man-made and natural disasters. Secondly, international cooperation on multilateralism, a rule-based world order, is desperately needed and essential. So to this end, the Global Development Goals, the Agenda 2030, is a pledge of solidarity between people, societies, and nations. It recognizes that peace, security, climate change, and development are closely interlinked. A sustaining peace agenda, together with the Sustainable Development Goals, provides the platform and the master plan. In theory, we have the tools. Thirdly, a focus on gender equality and civil society is needed. Research shows that gender-sensitive approaches enhance the effectiveness of peace and state building. Societies where women are economically and politically included in the society are less violent. The empowerment of women and girls, this is no news for you, is true example of smart politics and policy. It enables effective as well as sustainable peace building. One can firmly state that promotion of gender equality is not only a matter of women's rights, but more importantly, a matter of ensuring peace and security for all. So, ladies and gentlemen, as you all are aware, almost half of all peace agreements fall within 5 years. Wars are inherently difficult to end, and fragile states are the ones most likely to relapse into conflicts. Recent research and lessons learned from peace processes in, for instance, Colombia and the Philippines demonstrate that women's effective participation substantially increases the likelihood of peace agreements being reached and sustained. But still, we are all familiar with women being dramatically underrepresented in peace and mediation processes, as well as in all parts of the society, not least in the decision-making processes. A successful peace process and a sustainable, lasting peace is not only a matter of reaching a ceasefire, it is also a matter of justice, education, health, reconciliation, and fair distribution of resources. Peace processes and sustainable peace therefore inherently need to be inclusive. Women must actively participate in all decision-making processes at all levels and be active in defining priorities and resource allocation in times of peace and in times of war. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, when we understand the varieties or dynamic of peace, in other words, what makes peace sustainable and inclusive, the world should not have to spend billions of US dollars in humanitarian appeals. Peacekeeping operations will not be successful and peace not inclusive nor sustainable without sound policy and assurance that no one is left behind. High-quality research forms the basis for sound policy and political decisions. I'm sure that these days of discussions on a variety of peace will include many relevant and important findings that will help us defining the root causes of conflict as well as the key elements for being long-lasting, inclusive, and sustainable peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Her Excellency. Before the ambassador leaves, we would like to have a photo session with CSIS and the ambassador of Sweden to Indonesia. We will now move on to the next agenda, which is a keynote speech delivered by His Excellency Dr. Hasan Wirayuda, former Minister for Foreign Affairs, Republic Indonesia, in 2001 to 2009. He was also the chief negotiator on the dialogue between the government of Indonesia and the Free Aceh movement. Dr. Wirayuda, we will give a keynote speech addressing his experiences of the Aceh peace process. This session also is being chaired by Dr. Fitri Bintang Timur as the Executive Director of CSIS Indonesia. Dr. Fitri, you may have the floor.
Thank you, Anissa. There is a last-minute changes to the itinerary. I am not the head of international relation, nor the executive director of CSIS. I am a researcher at the international relation department of CSIS. And it's an honor and pleasure to be chairing the notable His Excellency Hasan Wirayuda. Most of you already know him. He's the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Indonesia for 2001 to 2009, Chief Negotiator on the dialogue between government Indonesia and the Free Aceh movement. He's also the Chairman and Joint Committee of the More Peace Talk, 1993 to 1996, leading to signing of Manila Final Agreement on the 2nd September 2nd September 1996. His Excellency is also a member of Presidential Advisor for 2010-2014, as well as, I need to mention this, the member of a board of CSIS Indonesia. So very happy to welcome him back again. A little bit of background of His Excellency education. His Excellency Hasan Wirayuda earned a Doctor of Judicial Science in International Law from the University of Virginia School of Law in 1991 and a Master of Law from Harvard University School of Law in 1985, a Master of Art in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University in 1984. And in 1971, he graduated from the Faculty of Law of the University of Indonesia and spent a year in Oxford University in the United Kingdom for earning his certificate in diplomacy. His Excellency Wirayuda is a professional career diplomat. He's a lawyer by training, but diplomat by choice, fortunately. His Excellency holds several important posts, including he was the Director General of Political Affairs of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's also Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the United Nations and International Organization in Geneva. Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary to Egypt in 1997 to 1998, and Director of International Organization of the Department of Foreign Affairs. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Your Excellency Hasan Wirayuda to the stage.
Thank you very much, Fitri, for your kind introductions. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'd like to commend Umia University and the CSIS of Jakarta for co-sponsoring this event. peace is not just a matter of the absence of conflicts, but certainly conflict resolutions is important factor to peace. Let me here present my presentations on Aceh conflict resolutions. I must admit that my problem would be how to shorten my presentations, perhaps only half of what I thought you need to know. So excuse me if by shortening my speech, I'll miss a few dots in the connections of all those I wish to say. First, on Aceh, root cause of the conflicts. To me, one of the important root causes of the Aceh conflicts was economic injustice. In early 70s, substantial gas was founded in Aceh and making Aceh rich or richer, at least in theory, but certainly this has created new awareness of the people of Aceh that Aceh is rich regions. But then in the 70s, until reform was initiated in 1998, we adopted a very strong centralized system, but also limited autonomy, though it was called a wide and responsible autonomy system. I would say it was stressed more heavily on responsible rather than wide-ranging autonomy. But Aceh was known, and still is, known as the veranda of Mecca, meaning a close strong religiosity of Aceh people, which majority of them are Muslims. But Aceh also, Acehnese are very proud people. The Dutch colonial government was only able to subdue Aceh in 1904, the latest among different regions of Netherlands Indies. So what's suddenly changed the approach to the solution of Aceh conflict? Of course, for 32 years under the military-dominated governments led by President Suharto, the only language for the solution of Aceh conflict was to crush them. This is a typical military language of solutions of an arms rebellions. So it took reformasi, a reform that was initiated against the background of multidimensional crisis that struck Indonesia in 1997, which, unlike some other East Asian countries, the monetary crisis turned into a multidimensional crisis, which led Indonesia to the brink of collapse. So that's why reformasi was initiated. And reformasi centers on 4 major agenda. Number 1 is democratization. Number 2, upholding the rule of law and greater respect of human rights, including the eradications of corruptions, cronyisms, and nepotisms. Number 4, is the introduction of wide-ranging autonomy. And of course, agenda number 4 was to recover from the severe economic crisis. So it took a humanist and pro-human rights president, President Abdurrahman Wahid, to initiate dialogue, to totally change the approach to the solution of Aceh conflicts from a military solution to dialogue and negotiations. And President Wahid assigned me to be the chief negotiator in dealing with the Free Aceh movement, as we call it, GAM. I didn't understand why I was appointed to be a chief negotiator. This happened when I was the ambassador and permanent representative of Indonesia to Geneva. A recent book written by former Secretary of State during President Wahid's administrations, by Bondan Gunawan, disclosed that he actually, of course, on behalf of President Wahid, is the one to explore the possible dialogue and negotiation with GAM. He met with the commander of GAM forces, but also he went to Sweden because GAM leaders was in their exile in Sweden. So it was in his conversation with GAM leaders suggested that I should be appointed to be a chief negotiator. I keep guessing why was the reasons. I knew Hassan Tiro, the chairman of GAM, when I was assigned to the UN Commission on Human Rights. Actually, he was my opponent in many debates, including on Aceh, in particular on Aceh. But I guess it was because of a close relationship with GAM and the MNLF. I helped facilitate the peace talk between the government of the Republic of the Philippines and the Moro National Liberation Front, and I knew from my friends of the MNLF that thousands of GAM forces and the ML forces were trained in Libya. So there's a connections, and perhaps my MNLF friends share their kind words about me with the GAM leaders. So, by the way, I was tasked to deal with the first phase of negotiations with GAM. There are 3 phases of negotiation. Number 1 was called the humanitarian pause. Number 2, COHA, cessation of hostilities agreements. Both were facilitated by, used to be called Henry Dunant Center, later on called Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, or HD. And the third phase was facilitated by the CMI, chaired by former President of Finland, Martti Ahtisaari. CMI stands for Crisis Management Initiative. So you can understand here, Indonesia was quite open. We went as far as Geneva and Helsinki, and by inviting 2 international NGOs to help facilitate solutions of Aceh problems. And indeed, in the history of Indonesia, Indonesia was very open to third-party mediations or facilitations since the birth of Indonesia. From when we were struggling during the independence war from 1945 to 1950, it was the UN who facilitated the solution of Indonesian conflicts against the Netherlands. And the UN established following the second military aggressions by the Netherlands. The UN established what we call tripartite commissions. So this is the genesis of the UN peace making and peacekeeping missions. Likewise, to close the conflict with the Netherlands, the United States mediated the conflicts leading to the Hague Agreements of 1949. But later on the West Papua, used to be called West Irian, again, in our conflict with the Netherlands, it was the United States which facilitated the negotiation called the Williamsburg Agreements, or later on also called New York Agreements of 1962. And before Aceh, we had the problems following the popular consultations in East Timor, in which the UN played an important role. But prior to the 1999 referendum in Timor, since 1983, the United Nations also helped facilitate the resolution of conflicts by establishing a tripartite dialogue involving Indonesia, Portugal, and the United Nations. I participated in that long process of dialogue. But for 16 years, the tripartite dialogue failed to find solutions. To me, it was because the unprofessional management of the process by the United Nations. You can imagine for serious conflicts of East Timor, the United Nations organized only twice a year, and for 1 day and a half. In the end, we spent most of the time for each 6 months to draft a press statement. So we didn't go far on the substance. In comparison, on the MNLF Philippines negotiations, we spent almost 80 meetings. 4 meetings at the highest level, formal peace talk, and 10 meetings of the mixed committee, which I chair, and quite a number of meetings at the technical or expert levels. But to have a meeting only twice a year, or 1 day and a half, certainly is not enough. That's what I mean by the bad management of the conflict resolution. That's why since the failure of Aceh, failure of the East Timor peace resolutions, on Aceh, we did not consider to go to the United Nations, but rather the option to go to an international NGO, Henry Dunan, or HD, Humanitarian Dialogue, and later on to the CMI. So in other words, we have a good habits of solving dialogue through negotiations and third-party mediations. But then why we opted for a dialogue on Aceh? Number one, because of the military failure to solve it. Military failure on both sides. GAM opted to settle the serious, sensitive political differences because they are championing for an independent Aceh, but likewise, the Indonesian government responded by deploying our military and police. But for 27 years, when we began to negotiate with GAM, military options opted by both sides failed. That's why in the wake of reform, in the particular process of democratizations, and democracy here is an important factor for us to explore new avenue rather than military solutions, namely dialogue. So I was often asked whether tsunami that struck Aceh on December 26, 2004 was a key factor to the solution of Aceh. I said no. To me, the key to the solution of Aceh is that the fact in an open and democratic Indonesia, we are more open to new ideas for solutions. And in an open and democratic Indonesia, the process of decision-making, internal decision-making within the governments allowed quite different views, in fact minority views, to stay, to be taken into account. I'll come back on this. So stalemate and reform or reformasi was key factor that opened the way to dialogue. Number two, as the entry point, it was humanitarian pause that facilitated the acceptance, easily acceptance by both the governments and GAM to start the dialogue process. Normally, to facilitate the peace talk, like in the case of the Philippines, which I knew well, we need a ceasefire agreement. But to negotiate a ceasefire agreements, likewise, would be a very difficult process, lengthy process. But by put the humanitarian issue in the forefront, meaning to save more lives, to address the problems, the result of the war, was quite attractive to both sides. And for time being, at least, we can put aside the difficult process of security arrangements for the humanitarian delivery of humanitarian assistance. So against this background, my first salvo at the first meeting with GAM, we said it in Geneva, or actually we met in Beaufort, 1 hour from Geneva, because we didn't want to tell the media, because otherwise the whole process would be somewhat disturbed by the media. So my first sentence that I addressed to chairman of GAM was that, and I said there was serious political and sensitive, serious political differences between us, for as GAM was championing for the independence of Aceh and for the Indonesian government, like many other governments, certainly would reject the demands of independence. Number two, that you have resort to arms, force of arms, and likewise equally responded by military response by the governments. But as a result of the use of force as to settle the serious political problems, sensitive political problems, as a result, thousands of people of Aceh, women and children, had to suffer. And I said to GAM leader, Santiro, if you truly claims yourself as the leader of GAM, and you opted for the use of force, think twice, I said. While on the other hand, your dreams of independent Aceh remains a dream. That's what I mean, the stalemate. So that's when I persuaded him, let us try to think an alternative options, namely to settle our differences not by the force of arms, but instead by dialogue. To my surprise, he immediately responded by saying, yes, I fully agree. So, by labeling the first phase as humanitarian dialogue, actually, in the process, we were able to distribute humanitarian relief assistance, and was able to reduce the IDP, internally displaced persons, from 6,000 to 1,000 and half. Though in parallel of the humanitarian assistance, delivery of human assistance, we made kind of ad hoc security arrangement. We didn't call it ceasefire, but in order for delivery of human assistance, we need at least a minimum ceasefire, kind of ceasefire. It works well. So that's why by 2000 we're allowed to go deeper into the substance of negotiations. Interestingly, we agreed on what we call Memorandum of Understanding on elements of the future governance of Aceh. Actually, later on we call it spatial autonomy of Aceh. But in year 2000, in the early stage of reform, I had difficulties to sell this idea to the Indonesian government. Because the government of President Wahid was weak and not well consolidated. He himself stayed only for 2 years and then replaced by President Megawati. And President Megawati was nationalist. He was somewhat lukewarm on the peace process. So that's why my difficulties to sell this good idea. I said good idea because later on, the government government itself in 2002 initiated, in fact 2001, initiated law on autonomy, wide-ranging autonomy, which means that the government delegated more powers and authority to local governments, but for region under special autonomy like Papua and Aceh, 70% of revenues that originated from that regions would be returned to local governments. So in a way, this addressed what was one of the root cause of the Aceh conflict, namely the economic injustice. So the autonomy of Aceh, as it is applicable today, is not by product of negotiation between government and GAM, but rather it was a result of the internal dynamic of reform in Indonesia. Second page was cessation of hostilities agreements from August 2001 to December 2002. Why August 2001? Because by August 2001 I was appointed as Minister of Foreign Affairs of Indonesia. That's why the supervisions continued to be done by President Yudhoyono, later on President, but then he was Minister Coordinator for Political and Security. It was under his close supervision that the cessation of hostilities agreements was conducted, still under the Henry Dunant Center. The ceasefire agreement was concluded in 2002, but in order to facilitate the monitoring of the ceasefire agreements, then a larger group was established involving the European Union, Japan, United States, and the World Bank. And the participations of these big parties somewhat complicates the peace talk itself. Because then, while the discussions was whether, the final format of the solution was whether autonomy or spatial autonomy and independence. And the HD, Mr. Martin Griffiths, was toying with the idea of the confederations. few days before the failure of the Tokyo talks or Tokyo rounds, he called me. I was in Mexico. I said, don't toy around with this idea because you can be sure the Indonesian government will reject. That's the end of COHA. That's why, as an alternative, Yudhoyono was appointed as president, elected as president, and his vice president, Yusuf Kala, was then in charge in the peace process. Yusuf Kala was a businessman, his background was very practical, and he then explored to the CMI, Crisis Management Initiative, to facilitate the talks. I think if you ask me what's the difference between HD and CMI, CMI leader, President Martyrs, was a statesman, well-experienced peacemaker. Unlike Henry Dunan, or rather, Humanitarian Dialogue, HD, which was ready to, with the backup of bigger powers, to toy with the idea of confederations for Aceh. Matthias Atisari was clear from the very beginning, from the first day, when he told the GAM delegation, if we want to talk about independence in this process, get out from my room. So it was clear from the very beginning that independence was not an option. That's Matthias Atisari said that you have to talk about spatial autonomy as a solution. And that helped facilitate the final agreement. But at the last minute, then the GAM came up with an idea. In order to channel their political aspiration, GAM proposed that local parties have to be established in Aceh. The process was reached to a point either we make it or break it, because while we persuaded GAM to sign the Memorandum of Understanding, it's not called agreement, just an MOU, and to deal with it later on, to submit, to refer the case of Aceh to have local parties, and to refer to the Constitutional Court, and the government would help. But of course, GAM would not like that idea, and that's why I insist on local parties. So at the last minute, the president invited for small group meeting, some 12 of us, ministers, chief intelligence, national police, and army, armed forces, and we discussed how to respond to this proposal for local parties when at the negotiating process we reach a stage of either we make it or break it. This is what I mean, that in the more open democracies we are more open to new ideas, something which may be considered as taboo beforehand. But also the decision-making which was very democratic. So among those 12 who attended, including myself, majority of them say no to proposal of political parties. I argued that because most of them said that it's not acceptable, it is inconstitutional or unconstitutional. But I argue that not a single provision in our constitutions refers to local parties, not even to political parties. And I was supported by Professor Yusril, an expert on constitutional law. So out of 12, only 2 of us, tiny minority. But even I managed to argue, Mr. President, let me play a devil advocate, but please don't label me as devil. I speak to the extent that how can Indonesia learn from an old country of old civilization, big powers like China, who solved the problem of Hong Kong through dialogue and negotiation. China was willing to have one country system. China allowed in Hong Kong local political parties, etc. Uh, in the end, my views prevailed. And instruction was immediately sent to Helsinki. Yes, we accept the proposal of Aceh to have local parties. Of course, it was not without calculations, because the problems of liberator mainly is to transform themselves into an effective administrator. Local parties at the first elections, 2015, 2014, earned a majority by 62% in the local parliaments. Recent election, April 2019, went down to 23%. Why? Because successive governors, which were occupied by GUM leaders, failed, I would say. Some of them went to jail because they caught red-handed by our KPK, anti-corruption commissions. So that's in short about the process of GUM, but in my conclusion, what lesson can we learn from this? The problems for a diverse country like Indonesia is how to manage our great diversity. But number two, as young nations, we continue to struggle how to manage the process of nation and state building. And in more open and in democratic Indonesia, there's new ideas, negative I would say, that tend to reopen the fundamental consensus of what Indonesia is. Henry Kissinger gave his warning, don't expect that in the democratic system, in the young nations, it would run smoothly as in the old democracies. Because he said, differences which are inherent in democracy in a developing nation may reopen the fundamental consensus on what is nation and state of Indonesia, like what is nation state of many countries. But even now, developed countries also facing similar problems. Look what's happened in the United Kingdom. When Scotland demanded a referendum, it was only by a small margin of 10%, but I read somewhere that it will be repeated again, and next referendum would, I guess, bring about the separation of Scotland from the UK. But likewise, Spain, Barcelona, Catalonia. These are an old nation state. For the Britain is 310 years old, and Spain is 305 or 7 years old. And nonetheless, they are having these problems of disintegrations. And my message to young and developing nations, we have to handle the process of nation and state building carefully. And how do we deal with our diversity, our pluralism? Democracy is one good system for that matter, but not absolute, I would say. Understanding the warnings given by Dr. Kissinger, which we are having here now in Indonesia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It's a very informative and detailed description on how the peace negotiation process take place in Aceh. It was 30 years conflict, 3 decades is a long time, and we're lucky that we have people like you and the Vice President Yusuf Kala that continue the negotiation. Now, maybe I don't want to delay further, I would like to know maybe if there are any question from the floor that would be directed to Your Excellency Hassan Wirayuda in terms of how the peace negotiation is. If there are any comments or any questions in terms of how perhaps the previous peace negotiation actually hold until now, whether, because Aceh, we can say, that is one of the successful example of peace agreement, and the peace is still quite, I can say, durable. I don't know whether because it's the creative solution of having local parties that wasn't being taught before, or whether it's actually being given a special autonomy, or perhaps what. And maybe I can call, or I saw a raise of hand, Ambassador Ghani, Matthias, and the lady, the man in front. Okay, maybe Ambassador Ghani from the back. May I ask to go in front to the mic to raise the question?
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Pak Hassan, for reminding us again about the process, of the difficult process of Aceh. One of the speakers before you talked about inclusivity. Could you tell us a bit more about how do you define inclusivity at that time during the negotiation? Because we know that you are dealing with GAM, but there are also other forces or other parties that is a stakeholders, I think, of peace in Aceh. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Rezan Ghani. Ambassador Rezan Ghani is heading the ASEAN IPER, Peace and Reconciliation. It's supposed to be a research body of ASEAN. Next, man in the middle with the blue shirt. Yes.
Saya bahasa Indonesia aja ya Pak ya.
Oh, okay. I will translate then.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because you are one of the key persons that was assigned. But I just want to know when it comes to the variety of peace, whether you approach are through relational or whether are conditional. Because when you mention about this economy injustice in Aceh after 10 years, the Human Development Index are still two-digit number, 18.5 somethings. And is there any, the central governments are giving more autonomy when it comes to the market access?
May I know your name and affiliation?
Matthias. I'm just the independent.
Okay. Thank you, Matthias. From front, and then one lady at the back, and then after we have a representation of women at the back, then we will close the first series, please.
Yeah, thank you, Your Excellency. You know, it was great, inspiring talk. I'm Song Yong Lee at the University of Otago in New Zealand. I'm particularly interested in how the trust between different parties to negotiation can be built. And in this context, I'm particularly interested in hearing a little bit more about your point that, you know, to put the humanitarian issues up front has been particularly helpful and, you know, for confidence building in early stages of negotiation. I hope you can elaborate a little bit more on this. And also I'm wondering whether you have actually operated any back channel to maintain the constant communication between the both sides. So, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Yang Jo Wei from New Zealand. The lady from the back, yes, please. Can you go in front?
Okay, my name is Fitri. I came from Borneo, and my specialty is about West Borneo. And it was interesting that to listen to the story of you, Mr. Hassan Wirayuda, about Aceh. And actually, there is like typical problems that I've seen when I heard friends, one of the participants represented here talk about Burmese in Myanmar. The conflict is it's quite the same, but they are still, the conflict is still going on, and the peace processing is still happening right now. And I think it would be like, they could get the lessons from peace agreements that has happened in Aceh. And so my question is about the MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, which has been done in Aceh. Currently, probably it's not really done so well until now. For example, the flag of Aceh. How about the flag of Aceh? Because in Memorandum of Understanding, it writes that Aceh can get their own flags, right? And it might be a problem now, but I just want to ask you if is it possible, the possibilities of Aceh to get the flag or not? Yeah, that's the first question. And the second one is, I look for the future. I don't talk about the past history, what has happened in Aceh, but in the future. So how could you predict that Aceh in the future? Because until right now, I've been from Aceh, and I stayed there for a few months, and I often go back to Aceh. And most of the activists, and also I met some Free Aceh movement, and they said that Aceh has no progress in a big way. I mean, like, it's progress, but just a little bit, because the MOU is not fluently happens until right now. And there's a lot of problem, like they have like kanuns and also regulation, like economically or social, and there is still lack of education there. There is still lack of economic development over there. So how could the Indonesian government face these problems? Because if there is no education in Aceh, it is no good education in Aceh, Aceh will not be led by the original Acehnese people. And the last ones is, do you know there is a lot of companies, like foreign company in Aceh, like gas, oil, and etc. So why it's led by the foreigners in Aceh? Why don't the Indonesian government or has initiative that most of the foreign company in Aceh need to be led by the Acehnese? Maybe it will be better. Or maybe like co-supervisor, probably the foreigners, but originally the leaders came from Aceh. So that's why. Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Hassan.
Thank you. They are all interesting questions. Maybe you can choose to answer the easiest first. And maybe then we can continue after that.
Thank you very much. I think all questions are difficult questions, so I would address all. Number one, Pak Reslan asked about the inclusivity in the dialogue process on Aceh or with Aceh. Well, in terms of participations of dialogue, unlike the similar process in the southern Philippines, we are fortunate to have only one GAM, one Free Aceh movement. In the southern Philippines, we have the Moro National Liberation Front, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, and the loose groups such as Abu Sayyaf and the communist groups. So that's why, to me, peace talks, peace negotiation on the southern Philippines was more complicated. So we have to deal with only with GAM, and GAM is relatively strong organizations. I believe that it will be more difficult to deal with weak organizations, likewise to deal with weak governments. So when at certain point GAM admitted that they are weak, they don't have a good negotiator, they don't have good people to know or for example, what is the concept of autonomy all about? You may be surprised. I propose to empower my counterpart. Because at one point when we submitted an agenda, they didn't want to discuss because they were afraid, and they didn't want to discuss the substance because they're afraid to be cheated. And then my habit was to invite my counterparts to talk outside the negotiating room. We spoke under the tree, and there we can spoke heart by heart. And this is a way of negotiating by using principled negotiation in which we address the underlying concern of our counterpart rather than to address my counterpart. That's why I managed throughout the process, but also until today, a very close relationship with all of them, So I'll come back on the inclusivity. Yes, I must say that on the part of government, members of my delegation, or later on delegation led by my colleagues, we don't have women, I must admit. But on the part of GAM, later on they also had in the delegations women's members. I don't know what other inclusiveness that Paris must meant, but in terms of negotiation itself, I would say that it was very inclusive, as we are only dealing with one organization, Pre-Aceh movements. On a variety of peace, yes, I said that the root cause was economic injustice, but it's not the only one, of course, but the very centralized system of governments was also the cause, in which the region has no say. That's why the antidote, the solution was, by 2002, the government itself introduced a wide-ranging autonomy, meaning to delegate more powers and authority accompanied by a very generous revenue sharing. But also democracy, as part of Indonesian and the process of democratization. Aceh people has a say, including to manage their own household. They elect directly their own leaders at district level, district head, mayors, and governors. It's not dependent on the central government. They have the power, the money, and elect their own leaders. So actually they should have no complaint to the central government. In Aceh, we went so far as allowed Aceh to introduce Sharia law. The only region in Indonesia that is allowed to have Sharia law, while at the national level, Islam is not state religions and Indonesia is not religious-based state. And our founding fathers opted for a middle path. We are neither secular in the Western sand, the strict separation with the state and church. We are not religious-based, but in Indonesia, promotion of religious life is part of the duty of the government. Humanitarian issues was in the forefront, but at the exit stage. By exit, I said that it was a tsunami, because for the delivery of human assistance, in particular during the emergency phase, from 26th of December to 30th of March 2005, there was an informal ceasefire established between the government and GAM. But for the ensuing process of rehabilitation and reconstruction, what was planned for 5 years, but when able to shorten it to 4 years, we need a solid pace, because otherwise you can have rehabilitation and reconstruction, which took place in every corner of Aceh, not only in the capital. We need relative peace. That's why the Helsinki peace agreement, I would say, actually it was called Helsinki MOU on Aceh, provide a conducive atmosphere for the ensuing process of rehabilitation and reconstructions. Do I have back channels? Of course. And negotiation is useful to have back channels. In particular, at the Helsinki stage, we have an active team operating behind the enemy lines, including reaching out directly to GUM negotiator. But in my case, I was established to develop a good, excellent personal relationship with GUM. On comments or questions from our friends from Myanmar, I know Myanmar until today has been spending much time and energy on ceasefire. They haven't yet entered into substantive discussions. Rather than to set a target to settle a ceasefire agreement with 16 minority groups, I would advise that settle with one ceasefire, dealing with substance, make one success story. This is, I think, the weaknesses of the process in Myanmar. But likewise, in comparison with Aceh negotiation was conducted in open democratic Indonesia. The military no longer have the final say. Though in the initial stage of reform, yes, the military had strong reservation on the agreement itself, but when the Helsinki agreement was about to be concluded, I remember very well, at the plenary cabinet meeting, President Yudhoyono asked the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Indonesia. And the commander said that as military professional, I fully respect the TNI, the armed forces fully respect the decision made, political decision by democratically elected governments. So you see here from 1998, the internal process of reform, which initially in the first 3 years was still opposing the peace negotiation, but later on, 2005, they said, Mr. President, I'm loyal to the decision you made as democratically elected leader. So the military has the contributions. In 2005, when I was chief negotiator, the chief of staff of the army openly said, I reject negotiation. The only solution is to crush Free Aceh movement. So there was a change also as a result of democratizations, internal military reform in which they accepted the political decision by the government. On the process, look, following the MOU on Aceh of August 2005, local parties were established, I think 4 local parties, and meaning as they demanded initially, this is an instrument where can they channel their aspiration, their political views. That's why in the first election in 2015, they earned 63% local parliaments. Likewise, as they also selected the national base parliament, their Acehnese were represented in the national parliaments. So if not all Acehnese goes to school, in other provinces too, that's why our struggle, how to increase the school-age children go to school. Though we are proud that in the reform era, our constitution was amended that mandated the government to spend 20% of the national budget for education. It's among the highest in the world. And for that matter, we have enough money to promote education. Aceh future. Well, Aceh is now back to as integral part of the Republic. I would say that Aceh would remain an integral part of the Republic. Any thinking by using the local parties to champion the independent Aceh, I would say it would be easily faced by the governments, including by deploying our military, because this is a violation of, it's not international agreement, but an agreement that is facilitated by the international community. And so far there was no thinking, I would say, for Aceh to again advocate an independent Aceh. Yes, there was, in particular on the part of the former GAM forces, but it is more a matter of local governments to deal with. Namely, it was promised for members of the forces of GAM to be allocated some 2 hectares of land for that way that can adjust to the civil life, being farmers and others be granted, facilitated with the credits. But this is something that the former GAM forces complain to their leaders. And instead of managing this well, the leaders of Aceh, successive governments, was caught red-handed on cases of corruption. But the socio-economic progress is a long term, but I would say that Aceh under Koha, meaning after Koha, the Acehese people were proud to tell me that now even a lady can walk to 2 o'clock in the morning and they was very secure. Meaning security-wise is good, socio-economic development is a strong and weakest point, like in other province. But I believe that MOU on Aceh of August 2005 was a good agreement. You refer to a flag of Aceh. In Indonesia, every province has a flag, but doesn't replace the national flag. In Helsinki MOU, there was a reference of Aceh flag, but this doesn't mean the former GAM flag. They may use the same color, but different design. We certainly cannot accept when GAM decided to join the government for them to continue to hoist the flag of rebellions. But flag is possible, like in every province they have flower of their identity. But this was an issue, I think around 2012, but no longer an issue today. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. We have limited time. Maybe I will invite maximum 2 more questions, short ones. Lady with the checkered shirt, and I think you're the only one. Please go to the mic.
For the opportunity. My name is Harudin, I'm from Jakarta. I just agree with the statement that Aceh have solved the problem because there is earthquake, like there is tsunami in Aceh. Then Aceh realized that Indonesia is important for them. Even in so many, what you calling, di bahasa Indonesia kan saja. Jadi ketika kemarin during pemilihan presiden, isu itu diangkat kembali oleh netizen yang ada di Aceh. Terus saya bilang ke mereka, kalian ingat gak waktu kemarin ada tsunami berapa ratus miliar yang sudah di-spend di Aceh untuk kalian, dan sekarang kalian teriak-teriak lagi untuk minta merdeka gitu. Terus mereka langsung shut up their mouth gitu. Nah, based on that story, saya mau sekarang kan kita juga ada masalah, we have a problem with Papua Merdeka as well. So do you think if we use the same method like what we have done for Aceh, do you think it will be solve the problem in Papua? That's my question. Thank you.
Okay, I was thinking whether Papua question will arise. Apparently, is would you be okay to entertain one more question from the floor? Yes, the young lady with the red shirt. Can you? Is it red? Oh, red. Yeah, please. Can you hold the mic? Thank you. Can you mention your name as well?
Before, let me be clear, I am a man.
I didn't say sorry, yes.
Okay. The honorable out of invitations, let me ask Mr. Hasan Wirajuda. Do you expect that Aceh becoming an independent state in the future? Because we saw today Aceh have a different rules, maybe Qanon Islamic rules. That's my question. Do you predict or do you expect that Aceh becoming an independent state or country in the future?
May I know your name and affiliation, please?
No, I'm a public, independent.
Yeah, may I know your name?
Oh, my name. Oh, Lalu.
Lalung. Okay, thank you, Lalung.
Okay.
Thank you. Both difficult question. Yeah, I think scholar usually study something in history. They don't predict the future, right? Yeah. Only at conferences does scholar obliged to predict the future. I believe that His Excellency is not a shaman or dukun, but learning from his wisdom and experience, I trust that he has the answer. Please.
I agree with you that to make predictions in politics is a very dangerous business, because one day is even too long in politics. But as mentioned earlier, we have to handle our nation state with care, because we cannot be sure what would be our nation state in the next 100 years or 500 years from now. As young nations, which mostly born after the end of the Second World War, state-preceded nations, while in Europe, even the youngest in the West, United States, they are at least 250 years old, and normally questions relating to the nation itself was settled before state was established. Here in developing countries, we had to do both nation building and state buildings. But when 310 years old country like United Kingdom, 305 or 7 years old like Spain, are now having or facing disintegrations. Don't take ours, a young nation, for granted. We have to manage our diversity with great care. Take it with great care. And more so in a country of great diversity of Indonesia, such as Indonesia, of 300 ethnic groups, each with their own language, not dialects, culture, language, and of 6 different religions. And interestingly, while we have been talking, at least until recently, on globalizations, at the same time, the forces of micro-nationalism is growing. Now in Europe and in the States, they are not talking much about democracy, but of populism, nationalism. So nation states are facing the pull and the push forces. From below, the growing of micro-nationalisms. From the top, globalizations, and regionalisms. In Europe, EU being a supranational organization, I would say it has a negative impact on the notion of nation state itself. Think why the Britain withdrew from EU at the Brexit process. But why Scotland are seeking independence from Great Britain, likewise Catalonia. So the nation state is under stress. That's why we have problem in Aceh. We used to have more problems in different regions of Indonesia. Likewise, as you mentioned about Papua. So Papua is also problems of how we manage our diversity. I went to Papua, I gave a lecture at the University of Cendrawasih in 1996. There I found the growing micronationalisms at work. There was a realization that there was a development in Papua, but those outsiders who enjoy the benefits of it. There was violation of their traditions, values, human rights by outsiders. And there's growing realization that Papua is a rich province. You name it, they have copper, gold, silver, gas, oil, and rich timber. And in the end, they want to manage their own household. This is similar to Aceh, actually. Now, with Papua assigned as special autonomy status, if only the money that the central government returned to the local governments distributed evenly to 2.5 million Papuans, their income per capita would be more than the income per capita of people in Java. But also in terms of development spending, there will be more spending per capita in Papua. But the problem of having so much power, so much money, because 70% of revenues generated in that province is returned to local governments. The problem is the problem of limited capacity they have in managing their own household. They choose their own leaders, but when people are not well taken care of, the welfare in particular, why blame the central government? Why then they think of an alternative system from special autonomy to independence of Aceh? Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Can we give a warm applause? And I will return to MC that will have announcement of a token of appreciation for Your Excellency.
Thank you, Dr. Hassan Wirayuda and Dr. Fitri. Now I would like to invite Professor Anna Jastat from Umeå University to the stage to give token of appreciation for Dr. Hassan. Please.
Thank you very much. I would like to hand over these sweets from the northern part of Sweden. It's cloudberries, a very exotic little berry that is grown only in the northern part of Sweden. So thank you so much for your talk. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have now reached to the coffee break session. You may enjoy the coffee break and snacks served outside this auditorium. And I would like to remind you that the next session will start here in this auditorium at 3 p.m. Thank you.